Good morning, students. Today we are going to start with the next chapter of your 12th standard from Bio Paper 2, that is Respiration and Circulation. So, as it is a human physiology chapter, we know that respiration and circulation. This chapter earlier was in 11th standard. Now it has been collaborated with 12th standard as a combined chapter, that is respiration and circulation. So first we are going to deal with the respiration. Now let's talk about respiration. Respiration is derived from a word respire, and the meaning of the respire is exchange of gases. As we know that atmosphere is the envelope of air, and we all biotic factor or the living organisms require exchange of gases for the survival value. So here respiration plays an important role, or it is a major physiological process taking place in the living organism. Respiration is a biochemical catabolic process which involves oxidation of organic food material to release the energy in the form of ATP. Right? So we know that in photosynthesis plants prepare their organic food material, so it is called anabolic process. But in respiration, the oxidation of organic food material takes place. That means the food material is broken down to release the energy in the form of ATP. So respiration is a catabolic process. Now here C6H12O6, that is glucose, which is the organic food material, gets oxidized. That means it reacts with the oxygen to release carbon dioxide, water molecule and ATP energy, that is 38 ATP energy. 38 molecules of ATP are generally released during this process. So respiration is a catabolic process as there is a breakdown of organic food material. The substrates which are been broken down during the process of respiration are generally called as respiratory substrate. And respiration is an exergonic process. Why it is called as exergonic process? Because a large amount of the energy is released during this process, right? Now when you talk about respiration, there are two types of respiration: aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. Respiration which takes place in presence of oxygen, aerobic; which takes place in absence of oxygen, anaerobic respiration. So today we are going to start with the very first topic, that is human respiratory system. Very important topic. Now, human respiratory system is divided into the two major parts. One is called as the respiratory tract and the second one is called as the respiratory organ. Right? So in short and in a rough, I have given you the representation of the respiratory system of human. So let's talk with the respiratory tract. The process of respiration generally involves inspiration, expiration and exchange of gases. This all three mechanisms generally takes place in the respiratory system of the human present in the thoracic cavity. So the first one, respiratory tract. The respiratory tract is made up of the following important part. The first one is called as the nose or the nostrils, right? Okay, so when you talk about the nose is generally present in the nasal cavity. This cavity is generally called as the nasal cavity. So the nose is generally present in the nasal cavity. Now, when you talk about this nose, it is divided into the two chamber, right nasal chamber and left nasal chamber. Right nasal chamber and left nasal chamber is divided by a cartilaginous tissue. That cartilaginous septum or a tissue is generally called as mesthemoid cartilage. So mesthemoid is a cartilage or a tissue that divides the right nasal chamber from the left nasal chamber, right? Now, whatever the nasal chamber are there, they generally contain your external opening or the internal opening. That means the nose generally contains a slit-like opening called as external nar or the internal nar. External nar generally provides, or the nostril, they generally provide the entry of the air into the nasal cavity. So the nostrils or the external nar, they generally allow the entry of the air into the nasal cavity. Now the nasal chamber is divided into three important parts. First is called as vestibule, second is called as the respiratory part, and third one is generally called as the sensory part. Now, vestibule, it is the proximal part, right? It is the proximal part just present above the nostril, and it is generally lined by the hair. Now, why the hairs are generally present in the nostrils? So that it generally filters the air and removes the dust particle. That is the function of the vestibule. Second part is generally called respiratory part. Respiratory part is the highly vascularized part, and it plays an important role in warming and moistening the air. And third part is called sensory part. This is a part which is generally lined by the olfactory epithelium for the detection of the smell. So whatever we generally have the power of sensation of smell, that is under the olfactory part or the sensory part, having your olfactory epithelium. That is the first part, which is called as the nose, nostril, or the nasal cavity. Second is called pharynx. You can see this part is generally called as the pharynx, right? So pharynx is a common passage for both food and air. It means that it is a small opening through which there is the entry of the food material also and air also. Now it is having two important parts. The upper part is generally called as the nasopharynx, and the lower part is generally called as the oropharynx, right? Nasopharynx is a part that is upper part, and this nasopharynx allows the entry of the air through which it enters into the trachea, and the food material through the lower oropharynx enter into the esophagus. So air from the nasopharynx will enter into the trachea, food material from the oropharynx will enter into the esophagus, hence called as common passage for the entry of the food and air. Now, whatever this pharynx is there, this pharynx generally have a small mass of a lymphoid tissue, and that mass of a lymphoid tissue exactly present here is called as the tonsils, right? Whenever there is an infection of the tonsils, we call it as tonsillitis, and whenever there is an infection of the pharynx, we generally call it as pharyngitis. So that's what about the second part, pharynx. Third part is generally called larynx. You can see here. Now larynx is called as the sound box or the voice box or the phonation box. Why it is called sound box? Because it is a sound producing organ. Larynx generally contains vocal cord, and due to the vibration or the modulation of the vocal cord, the sound is generally produced, so called as the sound box. Now larynx is a hollow tubular structure. This larynx is also called as Adam's apple after the discovery of Adam, right? So Adam was one of the scientists, and he saw that it looks like an apple, so he generally called it as the Adam's apple, right? Now the larynx opens into the laryngopharynx by a small opening which is called as the glottis, and the glottis is covered by a slit-like or a lead-like covering which is generally called epiglottis, and epiglottis generally prevents the entry of the food and water into the trachea. As I said that in the trachea only the air should enter, not the food and water, right? So whenever we generally swallow the food material, right? Okay, and by mistake if the food or water enters inside the trachea, we generally get coughing, right? So that is due to the epiglottis. Epiglottis generally is a small lead-like covering around the glottis that prevents the entry of the food and water into the trachea. That's what all about your larynx, also called as sound box. Fourth one, very important one, is generally called as the trachea. Trachea is also called as the air pipe or the windpipe. Why so called air pipe? Because it allows the passage of the air, right? So trachea is a air pipe, or it is also called as the windpipe. It is a hollow structure, and it is a tubular structure measuring about 10 to 12 centimeter in length. Now this trachea is lined by C-shaped cartilaginous ring. Right? This trachea is lined by the C-shaped cartilaginous ring called tracheal ring. Now, why the C-shaped cartilaginous rings are present in the trachea? उसके दो रीजन हैं, right? The first reason, it always keeps the trachea distended or expanded, right? वो हमेशा trachea का आपको ये trachea को open रखेगा, expanded रखेगा, distended रहेगा, so that the air can enter inside the lung. And the second reason, it generally prevents the trachea from collapsing. The trachea should not fall, should not collapse, so the C-shaped cartilaginous rings are present in the trachea. Right? So that's what all about your trachea, having your tracheal ring, which is air pipe or the windpipe, near about 10 to 12 centimeter in length. Next one is bronchi. Right? Now what happens here is that you can see these are generally called as your bronchi. Right? Okay, these are generally called as the bronchi. Now, once the trachea enters into the thoracic cavity, in the middle of the thoracic cavity, the trachea gets divided into the two branches. One is called right and left primary bronchi, right? Now this primary bronchi, that is right bronchi, will enter into the right lung and left bronchi will enter into the left lung. Now the bronchi will further terminate to form secondary bronchi. Secondary bronchi will form tertiary bronchi, and finally the tertiary bronchi will redivide and will form a bunch of capillaries which are generally called bronchioles, right? Okay, so bronchioles are nothing but the network which are generally formed by the primary bronchi, which terminates into secondary bronchi into the tertiary bronchi, and finally into the bronchiole. This is all about your respiratory tract. Right? Now let's talk about the second respiratory organ. You know very well, respiratory organs are the lung. So lungs are the primary, major and main respiratory organ of the human respiratory system. One pair of spongy, hollow, elastic lungs are present in the thoracic cavity, right? Okay, now these lungs are generally covered by a double layered membrane. That double layered membrane is called as the pleural membrane. Now when I see these lungs are generally covered by a double layered membrane, that double layered membrane is generally called as the pleural membrane or the pleura. Now as it is a double layered, one will be the outer layer, second will be the inner layer. Outer is generally called as the parietal layer or parietal pleura. Inner is generally called as the visceral pleura. Now in between the outer parietal pleura and inner visceral pleura, there is a space or a cavity which is called as the pleural cavity, and the pleural cavity is filled with a pleural fluid. A lubricating fluid is present which is called pleural fluid, which avoids the friction. That's what about your pleural membrane or the pleura, which is the covering of the lung, double layered covering. Now one pair of lungs, so two lungs. One is called right lung and second is called left lung. Right lung is larger than the left lung. Right lung is made up of three lobes. 1, 2 and 3. Left lung is generally made up of only two lobes. Right lung is made up of two fissures. The fissures are nothing but the division, and left lung is generally made up of one fissure, right? Right lung is heavier, left lung is lighter, right? And the entire lungs are generally surrounded by the ribs. They are generally surrounded by what? 12 pairs of the ribs. That is what all about the structure of the lungs, right? Now what happens is that in the lungs, further the bronchiole terminates into a bunch of grape-like or a balloon-like structure. Now what happens? This is your bronchioles. Now this bronchiole will terminate into a bunch of grape-like structure or bunch of balloon-like structure. This bunch of grape-like or balloon-like structure is generally called as the alveolus or the alveoli sac, right? Now this alveoli sac are generally the major organ where the exchange of the gases takes place. That is, oxygen enters inside the alveolus and carbon dioxide is eliminated outside the respiratory system through the alveolus. So alveolus is a bunch of grape-like or a balloon-like structure, and they are generally lined by the squamous epithelium. Near about 700, right? Near about 700 millions of your alveoli sac are generally present in the lung, and they play an important role in the exchange of the gases. Now you can see this dome-shaped structure, correct? This dome-shaped structure is generally called as the diaphragm. Diaphragm is a dome-shaped structure, right? And that divides your thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. This is your thoracic cavity where the respiratory system, lungs and heart is present. This is somewhat your heart, right? Okay, and this is your abdomen where the stomach and all the gastric organs are present. So the diaphragm is a dome-shaped structure which divides the entire thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity and plays an important role in the mechanism of breathing, which is diaphragm, a muscular organ. So this is all about your respiratory system of the human. Respiratory system of human is made up of two parts. One is called respiratory tract and second is called respiratory organ. Respiratory tract is made up of nose or the nasal cavity, second pharynx, third larynx, fourth trachea and fifth bronchi. Right? And the respiratory organ is made up of your lungs, alveoli sac and the diaphragm. Thank you.